Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we embark on a journey so ancient, so foundational, it's woven into the very fabric of our shared consciousness. You're floating now, adrift in that perfect twilight space between awake and asleep, your mind a blank slate ready to receive. The air is cool, maybe a gentle breeze stirs the curtains, and the house is silent except for the rhythmic beat of your own heart. But where your mind is going, it's not so quiet. We're going to a place of rustling leaves, the murmur of 4 great rivers, and a whisper that changed everything. A garden, a place of perfect bliss, where you walked with a divine presence. We're going to the Garden of Eden. And here's the reality check. You probably won't survive this journey with your old ideas intact. You're about to see just how much is hidden beneath the surface of a story you thought you knew. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the cusp of an ancient story, a tale that begins with a place of utter perfection. And if you've ever tried to picture it, to place it on a map, you've probably run into a little problem. The clues you see are laid out right there in the 2nd chapter of Genesis. A passage you've likely heard 100 times, but have you ever really listened? The text describes a river, a single river, flowing out from Eden to water the garden. Then, it says, that river divides into 4 heads, 4 tributaries, and it's right there, in that simple description, that our modern understanding of geography hits a brick wall. A river dividing into 4 separate rivers with their own distinct names. That's just not how hydrology works. Rivers join together. They don't split apart like a fork in the road and flow in different directions. This paradox, this one small detail, has baffled scholars and seekers for centuries, becoming the first and most frustrating piece of the puzzle in our search for a physical location. The names of these rivers are given to us with surprising specificity. The Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The last 2, of course, are easy. We know the Tigris and the Euphrates. They are the twin lifeblood of what is often called the cradle of civilization, flowing through modern-day Iraq and Turkey. They are real, tangible rivers. But what about the other 2? The text tells us the Pishon winds through the land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. The Gihon, meanwhile, is said to compass the whole land of Cush. This is where things get fuzzy. You're immediately presented with a geography that feels both specific and utterly impossible. It's a riddle wrapped in an enigma, with a little river-splitting magic thrown in for good measure. Now, a mainstream historical fact you should probably tuck away is that for much of early Jewish and Christian tradition, the geography was taken as literal. People believed these rivers were real and could be found. They didn't see the a priori problem we do with the 4 heads, because they were working with a different understanding of cosmology and a much smaller, less mapped world. The focus wasn't on the hydrodynamics but on the story itself, and the names of the rivers were simply part of the sacred text. Historians still argue whether the author of Genesis intended for this description to be a literal geographical blueprint or if it was always meant to be more symbolic. You'll find some scholars who argue that the author was simply using the most famous rivers of their known world, the Tigris and Euphrates, and then adding 2 others that were known from more distant, perhaps mythical lands to complete a grand cosmological picture. So let's take a closer look at these 2 lost rivers. The Pishon, with its gold and precious stones, has been associated with several modern rivers. Some ancient commentators thought it was the Nile. I mean, it's a huge river, and ancient Egyptians were all about gold. Why not? Others have connected it to a vanished river system in Saudi Arabia. This is a bit of a quirky tidbit. The modern study of ancient riverbeds, using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, has revealed the course of a massive long dry river system that once flowed across the Arabian Peninsula. It was a real river, and it flowed right into the Persian Gulf. This is called the Kuwait River, or the Wadi al-Batin, and it once fed a thriving ecosystem. Was this the Pishon? It's a tantalizing thought, a forgotten river of paradise found again, but there's no way to know for sure. The names don't match, and the geographical references for Havilah aren't a perfect fit. The Gihon is even more of a mystery. It's said to encircle the land of Cush. Now, Cush is a name we see in the Old Testament used to refer to two distinct places. It can mean the land of the Cushites, south of Egypt, which is modern-day Sudan or Ethiopia. This is where the Nile idea comes back with a vengeance. But Cush can also be used to refer to the Kassites, a group of people who inhabited the Zagros Mountains in what is now western Iran. See the problem? A river in Sudan and a river in Iran are on opposite sides of the ancient world. You can't have one river that splits and becomes both the Nile and the Tigris. And here's a little joke for you. The author of Genesis was either a masterful cartographer with a secret map of an anti-gravity river system, or they were telling a story that was never meant to be pinned down with a pushpin and a piece of twine. My money's on the latter. This leads us to a central challenge. Do we take the geography literally, or is there a deeper, non-literal meaning? For centuries, people did take it literally. The great Byzantine geographer Cosmas Indicopleustes, for example, believed the garden was on a giant mountain at the centre of the earth, a mountain so tall that the river split and flowed down its sides, with the Gihon and Pishon re-emerging from underground tunnels to become the Nile and the Ganges. It's a charming, if completely unscientific theory, and it shows the mental gymnastics people were willing to perform to reconcile the text with their own observations of the world. It's a testament to the power of the story that people would rather redraw the world than question the literal words of the text. The whole thing feels a bit like trying to find the exact location of Narnia. You can describe the landscape, the lamppost and the castle, but it's not going to show up on Google Maps. The Garden of Eden, as described, doesn't seem to fit into our current geological understanding. A quirky historical tidbit for you, the phrase, 4 corners of the earth, was not a literal belief in a square earth, but a metaphorical expression for the world's totality. A bit like how we say, the whole 9 yards. In a similar vein, the 4 rivers might not be a literal map, but a symbolic representation of the whole, a way of describing a perfect place from which all life and all rivers flowed, spreading to the far-flung regions of the known world. The 4 rivers might represent the cardinal directions, a way of saying everywhere, without having to list every single river. So, you're left with a choice. Do you search for a lost land where rivers defied gravity, or do you start to see the story as something more? This isn't a simple either-or proposition, and historians and theologians are still in the trenches on this one. You have some scholars who argue that there must have been a physical location, perhaps now lost to some cataclysmic geological event, a massive flood or tectonic shift that reshaped the entire region. This is where we'll go in our next sections. Others argue that the geography is deliberately mythic, a kind of sacred map of the human soul. Both are compelling, and both have their champions. For now, you should just get comfortable with the fact that the first clue in the mystery of Eden is a paradox, a riddle, a beautifully impossible description of a perfect place, a place that, on a simple surface level, can't possibly exist. And that, dear friend, is where our journey truly begins. So you're floating there, listening to the impossible river, that single stream splitting into 4. Now you must let go of the idea of a physical map, just for a moment, because where we're headed next is a place where that river might actually make sense. We're going to the most famous candidate for Eden, a place where civilization itself first began to take root. We're talking about Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. You'll remember those 2 rivers from the first section, the ones we could actually identify, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The ancient biblical author knew these rivers. They were the lifeblood of their world, the source of a vibrant culture that was already ancient by the time the Genesis story was being written down. The Mesopotamian theory is the big one, the one that makes the most immediate sense. It places the Garden of Eden right at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates in what is today southern Iraq, near the head of the Persian Gulf. This region is a vast, fertile plain, a veritable paradise in an otherwise arid landscape. It's here that the 2 great rivers finally meet, forming the Shat al-Arab waterway before emptying into the sea. And this is where the theory gets its strongest footing. The biblical text mentions 2 known rivers, and here they are, flowing through a land that historical fact tells us was the very birthplace of cities, writing, and organised religion. It's a place that was, for thousands of years, a literal garden of plenty, a rich marshland teeming with life and resources. You can almost picture it, can't you? Lush date palm groves, the rustling reeds of the marshes, the low hum of ancient cities like Ur and Uruk. This was a land of incredible abundance, a place where people didn't just survive, they thrived. This is a mainstream historical fact that's not up for debate, The Sumerians, who developed the world's first writing system, cuneiform, lived in this very region. Their civilization is generally accepted to be the earliest on Earth. It's a powerful argument. If you were going to write a story about the world's beginning, where would you place it but in the place where your own history began? It's a perfect fit, a neat little bow on a very complicated package. But what about the other two rivers, the Pishon and the Gihon? Remember those? The Mesopotamian theory has a few answers, but they're not as satisfying as the Tigris and Euphrates connection. Some scholars suggest that the Pishon and Gihon were not physical rivers at all, but canals or channels that were vital to the Mesopotamian irrigation system. Think of them as man-made, but no less essential to the garden that was this land. This is a bit of a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some ancient Akkadian texts refer to a series of elaborate irrigation canals as rivers, suggesting that the biblical author might have used the same convention. It's a way of making the biblical text fit a reality we can observe. The Pishon, with its gold and precious stones, could have been a trade route. The land of Havilah could have been a source of wealth, perhaps an area they traded with, and the Gihon, winding through the land of Cush, could have been a reference to the Kassites in western Iran, as we discussed before, a river leading to the mountains where they lived. It's a plausible, if not perfect, solution. Of course, the problem with this theory is that it requires a lot of could-haves. We don't have a definitive map of ancient Mesopotamia that shows 4 rivers, 2 natural and 2 artificial, flowing from a single source. And the biblical description of a river splitting still doesn't quite jibe with reality. It's an interpretation, not a perfect match. But the power of the theory is in its simplicity and its cultural resonance. It places the beginning of humanity in the very same place we know human civilization began. It makes the story a part of a larger historical narrative, rather than a standalone myth. Now, let's talk about the geography from a different angle. What if the source of the rivers wasn't the confluence, but the high ground where they begin? That's the other major branch of this theory. What if Eden was not at the end of the river's journey, but at their start in the highlands of what is now eastern Turkey? This idea suggests that the single river that flowed from Eden was not a river at all, but an underground spring or aquifer from which all 4 rivers sprang. In this interpretation, the single river from Genesis 2:10 is not a stream, but a hydrological source, an unseeable fount of life. This is a fascinating idea and a creative way to solve the 4 heads problem. The Tigris and Euphrates do, in fact, originate from the highlands of Turkey. So if we place Eden there, we solve one problem, but we create another. The Pishon and Gihon are now even more difficult to place. They would need to also originate from the same general area, which doesn't seem to fit any known geography. So you see, every time you try to pin this down, another part of the story slips away. Historians still argue whether the Mesopotamian theory is a literal historical account of a specific geographical location, or a symbolic tale woven around a familiar landscape. You have scholars who will argue passionately for a real place in Iraq, and others who will say the author of Genesis was simply using familiar names to give the story a sense of authenticity, much like a modern storyteller might set a fantasy novel in a version of New York City to make it feel grounded. The debate isn't about whether the Tigris and Euphrates are real, they are, but whether their inclusion means the whole story is a literal historical record. The Mesopotamian theory also has a strong emotional appeal. The idea that humanity's first home, its Eden, was the very same place where we first learned to farm, to write, to build cities. It's a powerful and romantic notion. It gives a sense of continuity, a feeling that our past is not completely lost, but is right there, beneath the sands of Iraq. It's a satisfying feeling, a feeling of coming home. But we must be careful not to let our desire for a neat answer override the complexity of the text. You see, the Mesopotamian connection is so compelling because the Genesis story itself is steeped in Mesopotamian culture. The flood narrative, the Tower of Babel, the creation story itself, all have strong parallels in ancient Mesopotamian myths. The most famous example is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story we'll get into a bit more later. It tells a tale of a great flood, a hero who builds an ark, and a divine wrath that reshapes the world. The similarities are too striking to be a coincidence. This suggests that the biblical authors were not creating a story out of thin air, but were drawing on a shared cultural heritage. A quirky tidbit: the name of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, Nahash, has been connected by some scholars to the ancient Mesopotamian concept of the primordial chaos serpent. a powerful symbol of evil and disorder. These connections give the Mesopotamian theory a weight that others simply don't have. It's not just a guess based on river names, it's a theory based on a shared cultural and religious worldview. So, for now, as you lay in bed, your mind can drift to the ancient marshes of southern Iraq. You can imagine the cool water of the Euphrates, the sun-baked mud brick walls of a Sumerian temple, the rustle of papyrus reeds, and the scent of date palms in the air. This is the most likely, most geographically sound, and most historically connected candidate for the Garden of Eden. But remember, this is just the beginning of our journey. This theory, for all its power, has its own holes, and there are other theories, other places that we must explore. The mystery is far from solved. Sleep on the image of that fertile land, the two rivers converging, and dream of what it might have been. You're still there, drifting in the quiet, the smell of ancient river mud in the air. The Mesopotamian theory feels solid, right? Like you could almost reach out and touch it. But just as your mind settles on that image of the Tigris and Euphrates, you have to remember that nothing in this story is ever quite that simple. The people who first wrote these stories weren't just creating a world, they were engaging with the world they lived in, a world filled with other people and other stories, and nowhere is that more evident than in the tale of the Great Flood. The Garden of Eden, this pristine paradise, is a place that's about to get washed away. And when it does, the echoes of that disaster can be heard in cultures across the ancient Near East. You're a passenger now on a boat made of cypress, listening to the creaking of the wood. The rain is coming down in sheets, a sound that is both deafening and strangely hypnotic. The Genesis flood narrative is one of the most famous parts of the Bible, a story of a world wiped clean by divine wrath, with only a righteous family and a pair of every animal left to start over. It's a story of judgment and rebirth, a fundamental part of the religious tradition. But this story isn't a biblical original. It's a tale with an older, much more cynical cousin, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely changes how you view the biblical narrative. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a Mesopotamian epic poem, written down on cuneiform tablets centuries before the biblical flood story was even a twinkle in a scribe's eye. It tells the story of Utnapishtim, a man chosen by a god to build a massive boat and save his family and all the animals from a cataclysmic flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. The similarities are uncanny. The boat, the animals, the divine warning, the release of birds to find dry land, it's all there. The details are a little different, of course. In Gilgamesh, the gods are a quarrelsome bunch who act out of spite and noise complaints, while in Genesis, God acts out of moral indignation. But the core story, the central plot device, is startlingly similar. So what does this mean for our quest to find Eden? It means the biblical authors were not creating in a vacuum. They were part of a rich cultural conversation. They heard the stories of the people around them, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and they adapted those stories, infusing them with their own unique theology. They took a story of a hero who survives a flood and turned it into a story of a righteous man who survives a flood that serves as a divine reset button. The flood wasn't just a disaster, it was an act of God. This is where the story gets its punch. Now, let's connect this back to our river problem. If the biblical authors were drawing from Mesopotamian stories, it makes perfect sense that they would place their own beginning in the same geographical region. They would use the Tigris and Euphrates because those were the rivers of the people who told the stories they were now retelling and reinterpreting. They were grounding their own sacred history in a geography that was already sacred to others. It's a bit like a modern movie that retells an ancient myth but sets it in New York City. The city is a cultural touchstone, a place of power and history, and setting the story there gives it weight. This is what the Mesopotamian theory does for the Genesis story. This is where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes in. Some scholars have suggested that the memory of a real massive flood in the Mesopotamian region was a shared cultural memory that was passed down through generations. There's a geological theory that at the end of the last ice age, around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, a massive dam of ice broke, sending a torrent of fresh water into the Persian Gulf, which at the time was a dry, fertile basin. This cataclysmic event would have wiped out entire civilizations and left a deep, lasting psychological scar on the people who lived there. The story of a great flood, of a world-ending event, would have been a story that resonated with everyone in the region, a story that was, in a very real sense, true to their ancestors. Historians still argue whether the flood narrative in Genesis is a direct literary borrowing from Gilgamesh, or if both stories are independent retellings of a shared cultural memory of a real geological event. There are compelling arguments for both sides, and it's a debate that continues to this day. So you see, the story of Eden is not just a story about a garden, it's a story about a world that was lost. It's a story that is immediately followed by a story of a world that was destroyed and then rebuilt. This tells us something profound about the narrative itself. The Garden of Eden is a place that can't last. It is a fragile paradise, a place of perfect order that is destined to be disrupted by both human action and divine will. The flood isn't just a punishment, it's a way of saying, that world is over, and this new one is the one we live in now. The fact that the Mesopotamian flood story and the biblical flood story are so similar doesn't just give us a clue about where the Garden of Eden might have been located. It also gives us a clue about the nature of the story itself. It suggests that the story of Eden is not a singular, unique event, but a part of a larger, more widespread cultural and mythological tradition. The idea of a lost paradise, a golden age that was destroyed, is a universal theme. From the Greek myth of the Golden Age to the Norse myth of the primordial paradise of Asgard, cultures all over the world have a story of a perfect world that was lost. The biblical story in this context is not a historical record but a theological statement, a powerful narrative about human nature, sin, and the consequences of our actions. As you lie there, you can imagine the sound of the rain, the rising water, and the world being reshaped. The flood story, far from being an interruption, is a crucial part of the Eden narrative. It's the event that definitively closes the door on the garden. The flaming sword and the cherubim at the gate prevent you from going back, and the flood ensures that even if you could, the world itself is different. It's a new world, a fallen world, a world where rivers split and flow in directions that make sense, a world where the search for Eden is not a search for a place you can visit, but a search for a memory you can't quite shake. The mystery of Eden, therefore, isn't just a mystery of geography. It's a mystery of memory, of history, and of theology. And we've just begun to scratch the surface. The storm has passed now, the water has receded, and you're left with a world that feels both familiar and brand new. The smell of wet earth hangs in the air, a scent of fresh starts and long-lost memories. Our journey so far has brought us to Mesopotamia, to the land of the Tigris and Euphrates, a place that makes perfect sense as a home for a lost paradise. But what if we've been looking in the wrong direction? What if Eden wasn't at the end of the rivers, in the flat, fertile marshlands, but at their source? This is where we shift our focus, turning our attention from the cradle of civilization to the high, rugged ground where it all begins. Imagine yourself now, climbing up from the dusty plains of Iraq. The air gets cooler, thinner. You're trudging up into the Anatolian highlands of what is modern-day eastern Turkey. Here, the landscape is dramatically different. Not a gentle, muddy plain, but a land of snow-capped mountains, deep gorges, and crystal-clear springs. This is a region that feels ancient, a place where the mountains themselves seem to hold a secret, and it is here, in this majestic, untamed land, that some scholars place the true location of Eden. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Tigris and the Euphrates, those two famous rivers, both have their sources in this very region. The Euphrates springs from the mountains near Mount Ararat, and the Tigris flows from the Taurus Mountains. They are born here, in this cold, high land, before they begin their long, meandering journey south to the Persian Gulf. This theory elegantly solves one of the biggest problems we faced in our first section, the single river that divides into four heads. Instead of a river splitting apart, you can envision a single, unified source, a great spring, an aquifer, or a vast, pristine lake high in the mountains from which all four rivers flow. In this model, the river isn't a stream you can see, but a hydrological principle, a fount of life that gives birth to the world's most important waterways. It's a creative and compelling solution, one that respects the biblical text while also making geological sense. It suggests that Eden was not a garden in the traditional sense, a low-lying agricultural paradise, but a highland paradise, a source of life for the entire world below. But what about the other two rivers, the Pishon and the Gihon? This is where the theory gets a little more speculative, but no less interesting. The highlands of Anatolia are also the source of other major rivers in the region. The Aras River and the Karen River are two strong candidates for our lost rivers. The Aras River, which flows through what is today Armenia, Georgia and Azerbaijan, fits the bill for the Gihon, with some scholars suggesting that the land of Kush could be a reference to a region in the Caucasus Mountains. This is a quirky tidbit. The ancient land of Urartu, located in the highlands, was a powerful kingdom that could have been referred to as Kush. The Karen River, which flows through Iran and into the Shatt al-Arab, is a good candidate for the Pishon, with the land of Havilah being a reference to a mineral-rich region in Persia. This interpretation of the rivers places all four sources in the same general geographic region, making the four heads description plausible. It's a neat solution, a little bit like finding all four corners of a jigsaw puzzle and realising they all come from the same box. The Anatolian theory also has a strong cultural argument. The land of Turkey, Armenia and the Caucasus is often referred to as the cradle of humanity in some archaeological circles. It's a region of immense historical and mythological importance. And let's not forget Mount Ararat, the traditional landing spot of Noah's Ark in the Genesis flood story. The fact that the mountain where the New World begins is in the same region as the potential location of the Old World's paradise is a powerful bit of narrative symmetry. It suggests a cycle of life, a kind of rebirth. The world ends in the highlands and begins again in the highlands. It gives the entire narrative a sense of place and continuity. Now, a quirky historical tidbit for you. A number of ancient maps, including those from the medieval period, actually placed the Garden of Eden right in this region. The Ebstorf map, a massive world map from the 13th century, places Eden at the very top, at the source of all the great rivers. The map shows the Tigris, Euphrates, Nile, and Ganges, all flowing from this single point. This is, of course, completely unscientific, but it shows that the idea of Eden as a highland paradise was a long-held belief in the Christian tradition. The medieval cartographers weren't worried about modern hydrology. They were worried about theology and placing a story at the centre of their world. Historians still argue whether the author of Genesis was describing a known geographical location or was simply creating a theological landscape that used familiar names. The Anatolian theory, like the Mesopotamian one, has its strengths and weaknesses. It provides a more elegant solution to the river problem, but it requires a more liberal interpretation of the names of the Pishon and Gihon. It's a debate between a literal, but geographically messy, account in the plains of Mesopotamia and a more plausible, but historically speculative, account in the highlands of Anatolia. Both theories seek to ground a spiritual narrative in a physical reality, and both are, in their own way, compelling. You can imagine now the quiet beauty of this mountainous landscape, the sound of a cold spring bubbling up from the ground, the scent of pine and rock. This is a different kind of paradise, not a lush tropical garden, but a pristine elemental one. This is a place of beginnings, of sources. The fact that it is a place where you can find the source of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and plausibly the other two rivers, is a powerful bit of evidence for this theory. It's a place that feels, in a very real way, like the beginning of the world. It feels like a place that could give birth to a story that would one day be told around campfires and in quiet bedrooms, a story that would be passed down through generations, a story that you are now a part of. The search for Eden is not just a search for a place, it's a search for a beginning, a source. And in these highlands you can almost hear the world taking its first breath. A gentle breeze rustles the leaves, and you can feel the cold, pure water of the Euphrates begin its long journey. The mystery continues, and our search for a physical location for Eden is far from over. The cold air of the Anatolian highlands is still in your lungs, but now you feel a gentle warmth, a warmth that pulls you south, away from the rugged mountains and down toward the sea. We're leaving the land of rivers and sources and heading for a place that's not land at all. At least, not anymore. We're going to dive into the most tantalizing and, dare I say, shocking theory about the location of Eden, a lost, sunken landmass in the Persian Gulf. This isn't just a quirky tidbit. It's a fringe theory with a surprising amount of modern scientific backing. Imagine yourself now, not walking, but floating. You're hovering over the shallow turquoise waters of the Persian Gulf, looking down at a vast submerged landscape. The water is clear enough to see the ghost of an ancient riverbed, the outline of a once fertile plain. This is the Persian Gulf hypothesis, and it's a breathtakingly creative way to solve the Eden mystery. The idea is simple. At the end of the last ice age, around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, a massive ice sheet covering much of the northern hemisphere began to melt. This caused global sea levels to rise dramatically, by as much as 120 metres. At that time, the Persian Gulf was not a gulf at all, but a massive dry basin, a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates, which are now separated by the vastness of the Gulf, once flowed together into a single great river, a Shatt al-Arab that was much, much longer. This giant river then emptied into the Strait of Hormuz, which was at the time a waterfall plunging down into the Indian Ocean. You can picture it, can't you? A huge, lush river valley, a veritable oasis in the middle of a very arid region. This is where our story gets interesting. The rising sea levels would have slowly, relentlessly, flooded this basin, turning it into the Gulf we know today. The people who lived there, who had a rich and thriving civilization, would have been forced to flee. Their land, their garden, was being swallowed by the sea. They would have carried the memory of their lost home with them, a memory of a place of unimaginable fertility that was taken from them by a cataclysmic flood. Does that sound familiar? It should. This is the same flood that we talked about in the last section, but this time it's not a biblical metaphor or a divine punishment. It's a real geological event that would have had a profound and lasting impact on the human psyche. This theory helps to solve the river problem in a way that is both elegant and modern. In this model, the single river that flowed from Eden and then split into four is not a river at all, but the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, which then flowed into the Persian Gulf. The two other rivers, the Pishon and the Gihon, could have been other rivers that flowed into this ancient basin. Remember that long-lost river system, the Wadi al-Batin that we talked about in the first section, the one that flowed across the Arabian Peninsula. That river, the potential Pishon, would have flowed right into this ancient Persian Gulf basin, this Eden. And another river, perhaps one from the east in what is now Iran, could have been the Sihon. All four rivers would have emptied into this single fertile basin, making the biblical description of a single river splitting into four heads a plausible, if non-literal, description of a hydrological system that no longer exists. This is a mainstream historical fact, though its connection to Eden is the speculative part. There is a large body of evidence that shows the Persian Gulf was once a dry basin. This is not a fantasy, it's a fact of geology. Using seismic surveys and ground-penetrating radar, scientists have mapped out the ancient riverbeds and the coastline of this lost world. They found evidence of ancient human habitation, including stone tools and other artifacts, which suggest that people were living in this area before it was flooded. The idea of a lost, drowned world is not just a myth, it's a reality. The Persian Gulf hypothesis is a theory that puts a fascinating twist on the idea of Eden as a physical place. It makes the search for Eden not a search for a land that is still there, but a search for a land that is now gone, buried beneath the waves. It also gives a powerful naturalistic explanation for the flood narrative. The flood isn't a miraculous event, it's a geological one. This would have been a profoundly unsettling experience for the people who lived through it, a world-ending event that they would have passed down through their stories and which would have eventually found its way into the biblical narrative. Historians still argue whether this geological event is the origin of the flood story. There are many other theories, and the connection is not universally accepted. The debate isn't about whether the basin existed, it did, but whether the memory of it and its subsequent flooding is what gave birth to the story of a lost paradise and a great flood. It's a compelling argument, but it requires a lot of if-then statements. If the people lived there, and if they were forced to flee, then the story of a lost garden makes sense, but we don't have a smoking gun, a cuneiform tablet that says, "We were driven from our beautiful garden when the sea came," a quirky tidbit for you. The ancient Sumerian land of Dilmun, which we'll talk about more in a later section, was described as a kind of paradise. It was a land of fresh water, where sickness and death were unknown. It was an island, a place apart. And while Dilmun is most often associated with the modern island of Bahrain, which is in the Persian Gulf, the memory of a lost paradise could have been a memory of the entire flooded basin. The story of a paradise on an island, a place of peace and plenty, could have been a memory of a time when the Persian Gulf was a lush oasis, a time that was lost to the rising sea. So you can now let your mind drift from the high mountains and the fertile plains to a world that is now underwater, a world of ancient riverbeds and sunken cities, a world that was a paradise until the sea came and claimed it. This theory is perhaps the most romantic and tragic of them all. It's a story of a lost home, a lost beginning, and it's a story that is in a way still being told today in the quiet depths of the Persian Gulf, where the ghosts of a paradise still lie. The water of the Persian Gulf is still lapping at the edges of your mind, a reminder of a paradise lost. But now, as you settle back down, the air grows heavy with the scent of frankincense and myrrh. We're leaving the lands of the Tigris and Euphrates, leaving the well-trodden paths of Mesopotamian and Anatolian theories, and venturing south. Far south, to a place that feels like a whisper on the wind, a land of ancient secrets and unimaginable wealth. We're heading to the Arabian Peninsula, and the connection between the Garden of Eden and this vast, sun-drenched land is a theory that, while fringe, is a truly beautiful piece of the puzzle. You're a desert traveller now, feeling the heat of the sun on your skin and the dry wind in your hair. You're following the ancient incense trade routes, those legendary roads that carried the precious resins of frankincense and myrrh from the south of Arabia all the way to the courts of kings and queens in the north. This is the land of the Queen of Sheba, a place of extraordinary wealth and sophistication, a land that was, for a time, a global economic powerhouse. And it is here, in the ancient kingdom of Saba, modern-day Yemen, that some scholars believe the Garden of Eden was located. This theory, which is definitely a quirky or fringe tidbit, is built on a few key pieces of evidence. The first is the sheer abundance of this region. The southwestern part of the Arabian Peninsula, particularly modern-day Yemen and Oman, was not always the desert we know today. For thousands of years, it was a fertile, well-watered land, sustained by monsoon rains that fed a rich agricultural system. The ancient kingdom of Saba was famous for its incredible irrigation systems, including the famous Marib Dam, which was one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world. This dam created a vast oasis, a literal garden in the desert. It was a place of plenty, a land of milk and honey, a land that would have felt, to anyone who saw it, like a paradise. The second piece of evidence comes from the biblical text itself. Remember the Pishon, the river that flowed through the land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good, there is bdellium and the onyx stone. Well, the southern Arabian Peninsula has long been a source of gold, and the region was famous for its precious resins like bdellium, which is a type of gum resin that was used in perfumes and incense. The onyx stone was also found in abundance. The land of Havilah, therefore, could be a reference to the rich, mineral-rich lands of the Arabian Peninsula. It's a powerful connection, one that takes a lost river and a mythical land and grounds them in a real, historical location. But what about the Gihon, the river that compasseth the whole land of Cush? This is where the theory gets a little more creative. While Cush is often associated with the land of the Cushites in modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia, the word could also be a reference to another region. Some scholars suggest it could refer to the coastal regions of the Arabian Peninsula, a land that was, at the time, a rich and powerful trading partner with the rest of the ancient world. It's a less than perfect fit, but it's a possible one. And it's a way of bringing all four rivers, or at least a plausible version of them, back into a single geographic region. Now, a mainstream historical fact you should know is that the civilization of Saba, with its capital at Marib, was one of the great powers of the ancient world. They controlled the flow of incense, a commodity that was as valuable as gold, and their wealth was legendary. The Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon in Jerusalem, as told in the Bible, is a testament to the power and prestige of this kingdom. The fact that a powerful, wealthy, and technologically advanced civilization existed in a land that was, for a time, a garden, is a compelling argument for this theory. It's a different kind of paradise, not a primordial one, but a man-made one, a paradise built on a foundation of irrigation and trade. It's a bit like imagining that the first paradise wasn't a wild, untouched wilderness, but a perfectly manicured, highly sophisticated garden, a testament to human ingenuity. Historians still argue whether the biblical author was referring to the Arabian Peninsula when they wrote about Havilah and Cush. The debate isn't about whether the Arabian Peninsula was a rich and powerful land, it was, but whether the biblical author was using it as a reference for the Garden of Eden. The idea of Eden as a literal historical location in the Arabian Peninsula is a long shot, but it's a fascinating one. It moves the story out of the familiar Mesopotamian landscape and places it in a new context, a context of trade and wealth and power. It also suggests that the Garden of Eden may not have been a perfect, untouched wilderness, but a place of incredible, man-made abundance. A garden that was not just a place of peace, but a place of power. This is a quiet, contemplative theory. There are no dramatic floods here, no lost civilizations, just a slow, gradual decline. The Merib Dam, after a series of collapses, eventually fell into disrepair, and the land returned to the desert it is today. The memory of that lost garden, that lost paradise, could have been a powerful one. A story that was passed down through generations. A story of a place that was once a garden, a place of peace and plenty, but which was lost, not to a flood, but to time and neglect. A quirky tidbit: the ancient Sabaeans were famous for their beekeeping, and their honey was considered a delicacy. The phrase land of milk and honey may have been a literal description of this region. So, as you let your mind wander through the sands of Arabia, you can imagine a land that was once green and lush, a land of gardens and great wealth. You can smell the frankincense burning and hear the gentle hum of bees. This is a different kind of Eden, a human one, a paradise that was built and then lost. And in its loss, we can hear the echoes of our own story, a story of a garden that was once a place of perfection, and which, through our own actions and the relentless march of time, was lost to us forever. The search for Eden is a search for a beginning, and in the sands of Arabia we can find a lost, beautiful and very human beginning. You're still there, right? The scent of frankincense and myrrh is slowly fading, replaced by the crisp, cool air of high mountains once more. But we're not back in Anatolia just yet. We're moving to a place that feels like the very heart of the mystery, a place that's not just a source of rivers, but a cradle of nations. We're going to the Armenian highlands. This region, which today encompasses parts of Armenia, Turkey, Iran, and Azerbaijan, is a powerful candidate for the location of Eden, and it's a theory that brings together many of the threads we've been pulling on. Imagine you're standing on the top of a rugged peak. The wind is biting, and all around you, the land is a mosaic of volcanic rock and emerald green valleys. This is a land of myth and legend, a place that feels impossibly old. And it's here, in these highlands, that the twin arteries of the ancient world, the Tigris and the Euphrates, have their sources. This is a mainstream historical fact, and it's the bedrock of this theory. We've talked about it before, but now we're looking at it with a new lens. It's not just that the rivers begin here, it's that this land is the beginning of so much more. The Armenian highlands theory, like the Anatolian one, elegantly solves the problem of the single river that splits into four. In this model, the river isn't a stream, but a great primordial spring or lake, a source of life that gives birth to the Tigris, the Euphrates, and two other great rivers. What are those other rivers? Well, here the theory is more specific. The Pishon is often identified with the Araxes River, also known as the Aras, which flows through the land of what was once known as Havila, a region famous for its gold and minerals. The Gihon, meanwhile, is often identified with the Cyrus River, also known as the Kura, which flows through the land of Kush, a region that could plausibly be identified with the ancient kingdom of Ratu in the Armenian highlands. This is a quirky tidbit. The ancient name for the Araxes River was often associated with a land of immense wealth. Ancient historians like Pliny the Elder wrote of gold being found in the river, and the region has a long history of mining for precious metals. The biblical description of Havila, a land of gold, bdellium and onyx stone, fits this region remarkably well. It's not just a guess, it's a connection that's been made for centuries by scholars and cartographers. The Armenian highlands theory also has a strong theological argument. This is a land of beginnings and endings in the biblical narrative. The flood story, as you remember, culminates with Noah's Ark landing on Mount Ararat. And where is Mount Ararat? It's right here, in the heart of the Armenian highlands. The story begins in a garden, a highland paradise, and when that world is destroyed, a new world begins right there, in the very same highlands. This creates a powerful and beautiful sense of symmetry. The end is the beginning, and the beginning is the end. The mountain that saved humanity is in the same region as the garden that housed it. It feels right, doesn't it? A bit like a story that comes full circle. Historians still argue whether the author of Genesis intended for these to be literal geographical references, or if they were using a familiar landscape to create a sacred geography. The debate is about the author's intent. Were they trying to give a historical account, or were they trying to tell a theological story that used the most powerful and meaningful landmarks of their known world? The Armenian Highlands theory is compelling because it suggests that the answer might be both. The author could have been using a known real-world geography to tell a powerful symbolic story. The Highlands are a real place, the rivers are real rivers, and the mountains are real mountains. But their placement in the narrative gives them a sacred, almost mythical significance. Think about it this way. The author of Genesis wasn't writing a travel guide. They were writing a creation story, a story of origins. And what better place to set the beginning of the world than in a place that is, in a very real sense, the source of life for the entire region? The Tigris and Euphrates, which nourish the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, all begin here. The life of the ancient world flows from these mountains. The author of Genesis, living in a world where the Tigris and Euphrates were the most important rivers, would have naturally placed the beginning of their story in the place where those rivers began. The Armenian Highlands theory is, in a way, the most holistic of all the theories we've explored. It brings together the rivers, the mountains, and the flood narrative into a single, cohesive geographical framework. It's a place that feels ancient, sacred, and powerful. You can imagine the quiet, pristine beauty of this place, the sound of water rushing down from the mountains, the wind whispering through the valleys. This is a place that feels like a beginning, a place that feels like it could have given birth to a world. And in our search for Eden, we're not just looking for a physical place. We're looking for a sense of that beginning, that lost sense of innocence and perfection. The Armenian Highlands, with its ancient mountains and its life-giving rivers, provides a powerful and compelling vision of what that beginning might have looked like. It's a land of sources, a land of myths, and a land that, in a very real way, is still waiting to be fully explored. The sound of rushing water from the highlands is starting to fade, and now you're back on the ground, in the quiet, dusty world of the written word. We've been talking about the 4 rivers of Eden, but so far we've only been able to identify 2 of them with any certainty. The Tigris and the Euphrates are real, tangible rivers, but the other 2, the Pishon and the Gihon, are ghosts. They are names on a page and geographical mystery that has stumped scholars and explorers for millennia. This is where we stop looking for a physical place and start trying to understand the text itself. Imagine you're an ancient scribe, a person living in a world of oral traditions and fragmented maps. You're trying to write down a story that everyone knows, a story that is part of your cultural DNA. But the story has some weird parts. You have a river that splits into 4. 2 of the rivers are famous, but the other 2 are, well, they're not. They are names that are a little bit magical, a little bit mysterious. They refer to lands that are far away, lands that are known more by rumour and reputation than by direct knowledge. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Pishon and Gihon are considered by most modern scholars to be either lost rivers, mythical rivers, or symbolic rivers. There is no major river in the ancient Near East that is today called the Pishon or the Gihon. The names simply don't exist in our modern geographical lexicon. So what do we do with them? The biblical text gives us a few clues. The Pishon, it says, flows through the land of Havilah, a land of gold, bdellium, and onyx stone. The Gihon, it says, flows around the land of Cush. These are our only breadcrumbs, and they're pretty old and a little stale. This leads us to a central scholarly debate. Are we supposed to be able to find these rivers, or were they always meant to be untraceable? The prevailing view is that they were probably not meant to be found in the way we'd find the Amazon on a modern map. They were part of a sacred geography, a way of giving the Garden of Eden a kind of cosmic significance. By placing the beginning of the world at the source of all the world's most important rivers, the lifeblood of their world, the author was making a powerful theological statement. The Garden of Eden was not just a garden. It was the source of all life, all wealth, and all civilization. It was a place from which all things flowed. A quirky tidbit for you. The name Pishon in Hebrew can be related to the verb to gush, and the word Gihon is related to the verb to burst forth. These are not just names, they are descriptions of the river's nature. They are rivers that gush, rivers that burst forth. They are rivers of life, rivers of power. This is not a description you'd give to a slow meandering stream. This is a description of a powerful, life-giving force. This suggests that the author was not just naming rivers, they were describing their essence. They were imbuing them with a kind of poetic and theological significance that goes beyond a simple geographical marker. Historians still argue whether the author was drawing on a forgotten ancient geography or was simply creating a theological one. The debate isn't about whether the rivers exist today, because we can all agree they don't. The debate is about what they meant to the original audience. Did they know what the Pishon and Gihon were? Did they have a different understanding of the world that would have made these rivers a familiar part of their landscape? Or were they always meant to be a little bit mysterious, a little bit magical, a way of saying, this place is so ancient, so primordial, that it contains things we no longer see? The search for the Pishon and the Gihon has taken scholars on some wild goose chases over the centuries. As we mentioned, the Gihon was often identified with the Nile. After all, the Nile flows through the land of Kush in a general sense, and the Nile is a huge, powerful river that bursts forth from a mysterious source in Africa. The Pishon has been identified with the Indus, the Ganges, and even the Danube. It's a bit like a game of biblical fantasy football, with scholars picking their favourite river for the role. The problem is that none of these theories hold up to scrutiny. The geographical descriptions simply don't match, and you can't have a single river in the Near East that splits and becomes the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Indus. It's geographically impossible. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can either keep searching for a physical location for these lost rivers, or we can accept that they were never meant to be found. We can accept that they are part of a sacred, not a secular, map. The Garden of Eden, with its untraceable rivers, becomes a place that is more than a place. It becomes an idea. It becomes a memory of a time before the world was broken, a time before we were lost. And the fact that we can't find the rivers is a part of the story itself. The untraceability of the Pishon and the Gihon is a powerful metaphor for our own lost connection to paradise. We can see the Tigris and the Euphrates, the rivers of our known world, but the other two are gone, just as our connection to the garden is gone. As you lay there, you can let your mind drift to the idea of lost rivers, rivers that flow in a land that is no longer there, rivers that gush and burst forth, carrying gold and precious stones, but which we can no longer see. The mystery of the Pishon and the Gihon isn't a flaw in the story, it's the very point of the story. It's a way of saying, this is a memory of a world that is no longer ours. This is a story of a place we can never go back to. And in that untraceability and that mystery, we can find a kind of peace. The search for Eden is not a search for a place, but a search for a memory. And some memories, like some rivers, are meant to be lost. You're still there, aren't you? The quiet drone of the fan, the gentle darkness. We've spent so much time looking for Eden on a map, tracing rivers that may or may not have existed. But what if the whole enterprise is a fool's errand? What if the search for a physical location is a fundamental misunderstanding of the story itself? Now, you can let go of the map altogether. You're no longer an explorer, you're a scholar, a theologian, a poet. You're beginning to understand that the Garden of Eden may not have been a place you could ever visit, but a metaphor, a symbol, a theological landscape designed to teach us something about ourselves and our relationship with the divine. This is a mainstream historical fact. For a large number of scholars, the Garden of Eden is a parable. It's a powerful mythic story designed to explain the origin of sin, suffering, and the human condition. It's not a historical account of a specific event, but a foundational story about the human experience. It's a bit like Aesop's fables. You don't go looking for the wolf who cried boy, you listen to the story and you learn the lesson. The story of Eden, in this view, is a lesson about innocence, temptation, and the loss of a perfect, unburdened existence. It's a story about the world as it was meant to be, and the world as it is now. So let's unpack this idea. If Eden is a metaphor, what does it mean? The garden itself, this pristine, perfect place, is a symbol of a state of innocence and harmony. It's a place where there is no suffering, no sickness, no death. It's a place where you walk with a divine presence, a place where there is no division between the sacred and the secular. It's a beautiful, idealized world that we can all recognize in our own deepest longings for peace and perfection. It's the world we dream of when we close our eyes at night. The river, that single river that splits into four heads. That's not a geographical paradox, it's a theological statement. It's a symbol of the source of life, all of civilization, all of the world's most important rivers and their cultures flow from a single divine source. It's a way of saying that God is the origin of everything, that all life flows from the divine. The fact that the river splits into 4, a number that symbolises the 4 corners of the world, is a way of saying that this life-giving force flows to every corner of the earth. It's a cosmic map, not a terrestrial one. Now, a quirky tidbit for you. The word Eden itself has a fascinating etymology. It's a loan word from the Akkadian language, and it means fertile plain. So the Garden of Eden is literally a garden of the fertile plain. But in the biblical context, it takes on a deeper meaning. It's not just a fertile place, it's a place of delight or pleasure. The author of Genesis, in this interpretation, is using a familiar word for a fertile place and imbuing it with a new theological meaning. Eden isn't just a good place to grow things, it's a delightful, pleasurable, perfect place. It's a subtle shift that completely changes the meaning of the word, turning a geographical term into a theological concept. Historians still argue whether the author of Genesis was creating a theological landscape from scratch, or if they were taking a known, real-world location and imbuing it with a spiritual meaning. The debate isn't about whether the story is true or false in a modern scientific sense. The debate is about the author's intent. Were they writing history, or were they writing theology? The scholarly consensus leans heavily towards the latter. The author of Genesis, in this view, was not a historian in the modern sense of the word. They were a theologian, and their primary goal was to explain the origins of the world and humanity's place in it. The most powerful argument for the metaphorical view is that it makes the rest of the story make sense. The serpent, the trees, the forbidden fruit. They are all part of a larger symbolic narrative. The serpent isn't a literal snake, it's a symbol of temptation, evil, and chaos. The forbidden fruit isn't an apple, it's a symbol of knowledge and disobedience. The loss of the garden isn't just a physical banishment, it's a metaphorical banishment from a state of innocence and grace. It's a story of our own fall, of our own decision to choose our own knowledge over divine wisdom. It's a story of how we left a state of perfection and entered a state of suffering, a state where we must toil for our food and live with the knowledge of our own mortality. The great German theologian Gerhard von Rad argued that the story of Eden is a story of the origin of the present human situation. It's a story about why the world is the way it is. Why do we suffer? Why do we toil? Why is there death? The answer, according to the story, is that we chose it. We chose to leave the garden. The Garden of Eden, therefore, is not a place that we can ever go back to. It's not a place we can find on a map. It's a memory of a lost innocence, a memory that we carry with us, a memory that informs our every action and our every longing. So as you drift deeper into the quiet, you can let go of your search for a physical place. The Garden of Eden is not in Mesopotamia, or Anatolia, or Arabia, or a lost sunken basin in the Persian Gulf. It's in the story itself. It's in the text. It's in the very idea of a perfect world that was lost. The search for Eden is not an archaeological one. It's a spiritual one. It's a search for a memory, a search for an innocence that we all lost a long, long time ago. The idea of Eden as a metaphor is a powerful one, but it doesn't mean we should abandon the symbols of the story. On the contrary, if Eden is a metaphorical landscape, then the objects within it are not just objects, they are powerful symbols, and none are more central to the story, or more rich with meaning, than the 2 trees that stand at the centre of the garden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You're walking through the garden now, and you can see them. 2 magnificent ancient trees, their leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. You're drawn to them, not just by their beauty, but by a sense of their profound importance. The tree of life, you're told, is the source of immortality. Eat from its fruit, and you'll live forever. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you're told, is the source of knowledge. Eat from its fruit, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And here is where our story turns. The choice between these 2 trees is the central decision of the entire narrative, and the symbolism of that choice is what truly matters. Let's start with the tree of life. In the context of the garden, it's a symbol of unconditional immortality and divine grace. It's a gift from God, a promise of eternal life that is freely given, with no conditions. It represents a state of being where you are in perfect harmony with the divine, a state of being where death has no dominion. It's a beautiful, innocent and pure symbol. But the story, as we know, doesn't end there. After the fall, after Adam and Eve eat from the other tree, they are banished from the garden and a flaming sword is placed at the gate to prevent them from ever eating from the tree of life. Why? Because an immortal human who has been corrupted by sin would be a truly terrifying thing. The tree of life, in a way, is a reward that must be earned, a gift that cannot be given to a flawed and fallen humanity. This is a mainstream historical fact that you should know. The concept of a tree of life is not unique to the biblical narrative. It's a common motif in ancient Near Eastern mythology. The Sumerians had a similar concept, a sacred tree that conferred immortality, guarded by a powerful god. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which we've talked about before, has a similar story. The hero, Gilgamesh, goes on a quest to find the plant of eternal life, a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea. He finds it, but a serpent steals it from him. The serpent in that story becomes a symbol of the loss of immortality, a recurring theme that we see in the Garden of Eden. The fact that the tree of life is a shared mythological motif suggests that the biblical authors were once again drawing on a shared cultural heritage. Now, let's turn to the other tree, the one that causes all the trouble. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What exactly is this knowledge? It's not just a knowledge of facts or information. It's a knowledge of the moral duality of the universe. It's the ability to distinguish between good and evil, to make moral judgments, to understand right and wrong. But this knowledge comes at a cost. In the garden, there was no need for this knowledge. Everything was good. There was no evil to know. The tree, therefore, is a symbol of a choice to move from a state of innocence to a state of moral awareness. It's the moment you stop being a child and start being an adult. This is a quirky tidbit. Some scholars have suggested that the knowledge is not just moral, but also sexual. The phrase "to know" in the Bible is often used as a euphemism for sexual intimacy. The story of Adam and Eve's shame, their sudden awareness of their nakedness, is seen as evidence of this. The forbidden fruit, in this interpretation, isn't just a knowledge of good and evil. It's a knowledge of their own sexuality, a knowledge that comes with a loss of innocence and a new sense of shame. It's an interesting and very human way of looking at the story, and it gives the narrative a whole new layer of meaning. Historians still argue whether the forbidden fruit was a literal piece of fruit or a symbolic act. The debate isn't about what kind of fruit it was. It's never actually identified as an apple, by the way. That's a later tradition. The debate is about the nature of the act itself. Was it a simple act of disobedience, or was it a complex, nuanced act of self-determination? The scholarly consensus is that it was a little of both. It was an act of disobedience, but it was also a choice to become a free, moral agent. The choice to eat the fruit was the choice to be human, to be mortal, to be a creature who must choose between good and evil. It's the birth of consciousness. The two trees, in this metaphorical reading, represent two different paths. The tree of life represents a path of passive immortality and unconditional grace, a path of eternal childhood. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents a path of active mortality and moral responsibility, a path of adulthood. The choice to eat from the second tree is the choice to take on the burden of consciousness, the burden of moral choice, the burden of being human. It's a beautiful, tragic, and deeply profound story, and the trees at the centre of it are not just props, they are the very heart of the narrative. So as you close your eyes, you can see the two trees standing there, bathed in a soft, ethereal light. The tree of life, with its promise of eternity. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, with its promise of wisdom. And you can feel the weight of the choice that was made so long ago, a choice that still echoes in our world today. The search for Eden is not a search for a place, but a search for a state of being. And the two trees at the centre of the garden are a constant reminder of the state of being that was lost, and the state of being that we now inhabit. We are the children of the tree of knowledge, and we are forever on a quest for the tree of life. The trees, the rivers, the paradox of a perfect world, it's all part of a powerful story. But where did that story come from? Was the biblical author a true original, or were they part of a larger conversation that was happening all across the ancient world? Now, you can let your mind drift from the specific details of the garden and zoom out to the broad, sweeping landscape of ancient myth. You're no longer a participant in the story, you're an anthropologist, a folklorist, a person who sees a single beautiful thread weaving its way through a tapestry of cultures. This is a mainstream historical fact. The story of Eden is not an isolated one. It's a part of a larger tradition of paradise myths that can be found in cultures all over the world. The idea of a lost golden age, a primordial paradise, a place of peace and plenty that was lost due to some act of disobedience or a great cataclysm. This is a universal theme. It's a story that speaks to something deep inside us, a longing for a world that was once better than this one. Let's look at some of these mythological parallels. In ancient Greek mythology, there was the myth of the Golden Age. This was a time when humans lived in perfect harmony with nature, a time before labour, sickness, or old age. The world was a paradise, and humans lived without toil, much like Adam and Eve in the garden. But this age was lost, and it was replaced by the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and eventually our own, the Iron Age, a time of war, suffering, and toil. The parallels are striking, aren't they? The loss of a Golden Age, a time of perfection, is a theme that resonates deeply in both the Greek and biblical narratives. Now let's go a little further east. In ancient Persian mythology, there was the idea of a primordial paradise called Aryan-Mvaya, the Aryan expanse. This was a perfect land, the first land created by the benevolent god Ahura Mazda. It was a place of abundance and happiness, but it was corrupted by the forces of evil, and it was eventually destroyed by a great flood and a massive winter. The parallels here are also powerful. A perfect primordial land is corrupted by evil, and then it's destroyed by a cataclysm. The story of a perfect world and its subsequent fall is a theme that runs through both Persian and biblical traditions. A quirky tidbit for you. The ancient Celtic tradition of the otherworld, or Tir na Nog, the land of youth, is another fascinating parallel. This was a supernatural realm, a land of eternal youth, beauty, and happiness, a place where no one ever grew old or sick. It was a land of abundance, a place where food was always plentiful, a place where people lived in perfect harmony with nature. It was, in a very real sense, a paradise. The only way to get there was to be invited by a supernatural being, and if you ever left, you couldn't go back, and the years would catch up to you in an instant. This idea of a paradise that is out of reach, a place that you can't return to, is a powerful one, and it's a theme that we see in the biblical story of Eden. Historians still argue whether these mythological parallels are a coincidence, or if they're a result of cultural diffusion. Did the biblical authors borrow from these other cultures? Or are all these cultures simply tapping into a universal human longing for a lost paradise? The debate isn't about whether the similarities exist, they clearly do. The debate is about the origin of those similarities. It's a bit like asking if all the world's languages came from a single source, or if they all evolved independently. The answer is probably a little of both. There was likely some borrowing and cultural exchange, but there was also a shared human experience that gave rise to these similar stories. The fact that so many cultures have a paradise myth tells us something profound about the human psyche. It tells us that we have a deep, enduring sense that the world is not as it should be. We have a sense of loss, a sense of a world that was once better, a world that was once more perfect. The story of Eden, in this context, is not just a Jewish or Christian story. It's a human story. It's a story that speaks to our collective sense of guilt and our collective longing for redemption. It's a story about why we feel a little bit broken and a little bit lost, in a world that feels a little bit broken and a little bit lost. The purpose of these paradise myths isn't just to tell a story about the past, it's to tell a story about the present. It's a way of saying, this is why things are the way they are. It's a way of explaining suffering and toil and death. It's a way of giving our lives a sense of meaning and purpose in a world that is often chaotic and unjust. The Garden of Eden, with its rivers, its trees and its serpent, is a beautiful and powerful expression of this universal human truth. It's a story that tells us where we came from and why we are the way we are. And in that, there is a kind of comfort, a kind of peace. We are not just a random collection of atoms in a meaningless universe. We are the children of a lost paradise, and we're on a long, slow journey back. You're drifting now on the surface of these ancient myths, and you can see a common thread, a perfect world, a fall, a serpent. We've talked about the serpent as a symbol of temptation, but what if it's more than that? What if the serpent in the garden isn't just a simple snake, but a powerful ancient figure with a history that predates the biblical narrative? Now you can let your mind go a little bit further, a little bit darker, as we explore some of the more fringe theories about the serpent and its connection to other mythologies, and even to the idea of fallen angels. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit. A number of scholars have suggested that the serpent in the Garden of Eden is not a literal snake at all, but a mythological figure known as a watcher. The Watchers were a class of angels or divine beings mentioned in the non-canonical Book of Enoch and other ancient Jewish texts. According to these texts, the Watchers were sent to Earth to watch over humanity, but they became corrupted. They lusted after human women, descended to Earth, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, things like metallurgy, cosmetics, and warfare. The offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, a race of giants. The Book of Enoch portrays the Watchers as the source of all evil on Earth, and their rebellion against God is seen as the original sin. The connection to Eden is compelling. In the garden, the serpent is a being who knows and who imparts forbidden knowledge to humanity, leading to their fall. The Watchers, in a similar vein, are beings who impart forbidden knowledge and lead to a fall. The idea that the serpent is a watcher, a powerful, rebellious angel who is corrupting humanity, gives the story a much grander, more cosmic scale. It's not just a story about a man, a woman, and a snake. It's a story about a rebellion in the heavens that has a direct and devastating impact on the human world. Now, a mainstream historical fact you should know. The Book of Enoch was not included in the Jewish or Christian biblical canon, but it was a widely read and highly influential text in the Second Temple period. The authors of the New Testament, in fact, seem to have been familiar with it, and it's referenced in the Book of Jude. This tells us that the idea of the Watchers was a well-known part of the ancient Jewish cultural and theological landscape. It's not a modern invention, it's a very old idea, and the idea that the serpent in the garden could be connected to this ancient tradition is a plausible one. Historians still argue whether the author of Genesis was aware of the Watcher tradition, and was deliberately alluding to it. The debate isn't about whether the Watchers existed in mythology. They clearly did. The debate is about the author's intent. Was the serpent a simple snake, or was it a veiled reference to a more powerful, more ancient figure of evil? The scholarly consensus is that it's difficult to say for sure. The text of Genesis is very spare and doesn't give us many clues. The serpent is simply described as being more subtle than any beast of the field. But the possibility of a deeper, more profound connection is a fascinating one, and it's a way of reading the story that gives it a much greater theological weight. Another parallel, and a quirky tidbit for you, is the connection to the ancient Mesopotamian concept of the primordial chaos serpent. In many ancient Near Eastern mythologies, the world was created from a battle between a powerful god and a chaos serpent. The god would defeat the serpent, and the world would be created from its body. The serpent in this context is not just a figure of evil, but a figure of primordial, untamed chaos. The serpent in the Garden of Eden, therefore, could be a lingering echo of this ancient myth. It's a symbol of the untamed, chaotic forces that still exist, even in a perfect, ordered world. The battle between good and evil, between order and chaos, begins in the garden, and the serpent is the first volley in that war. The idea of the serpent as a figure of cosmic evil gives the story a much more dramatic and profound meaning. The temptation isn't just about a piece of fruit, it's about a choice between divine order and primordial chaos. It's a choice between the world as God intended it to be and the world as it could be, a world of forbidden knowledge and moral duality. It's a choice that has consequences not just for humanity, but for the entire cosmos. As you lay there, you can feel the quiet unease of this new perspective. The serpent is not just a snake, it's a whisper of a much older, much darker story. It's a story about a rebellion in the heavens, a battle between cosmic forces, a battle that has spilled over into our world. The Garden of Eden, in this view, is not just a place of peace and innocence. It's a battleground. It's a place where the fate of the world is decided. And the serpent, that beautiful, subtle creature, is the first shot in that war. The serpent is slithering away into the shadows of your mind, and you're now turning to a new, and perhaps more gentle idea of a garden. We're leaving the shadowy world of fallen angels and chaos serpents, and returning to the sun-drenched plains of ancient Mesopotamia. But this time, we're not looking at the flood narrative. We're looking at a different, and much older idea of paradise, the Sumerian paradise of Dilmun. Imagine yourself on a small boat. gently rocking on the waters of the Persian Gulf. You're heading to an island, a place that, in the ancient Sumerian imagination, was a land of myth and magic. This is Dilmun, and its description in ancient cuneiform texts is startlingly similar to the biblical description of Eden. This is a mainstream historical fact that you should know. The Sumerians, who were one of the first civilizations on Earth, had a myth of a perfect primordial paradise. In their myths, Dilmun was a beautiful, pure and clean land, a land where there was no sickness, no death, and no old age. It was a place where the raven does not cry, the lion does not kill, and the wolf does not devour the lamb. Does that sound familiar? It should. It's a description that could have been lifted directly from the biblical prophet's vision of a redeemed world, a world where the wolf lies down with the lamb. The parallels are not just limited to the general description of a paradise. In the Sumerian myth, the goddess Ninhursag creates a beautiful garden in Dilmun. She plants a garden, and she uses 8 plants. And then, the god Enki, a god of water and wisdom, eats those plants. Ninhursag is furious and curses Enki, saying that he will die. Enki becomes sick and his body begins to fail. The other gods, concerned about the loss of one of their most powerful members, convince Ninhursag to heal him. She does by giving birth to 8 goddesses, one for each part of his body that was sick. She creates life to heal the sickness that came from a forbidden act. The parallels to the story of Eden are striking. A divine being, a garden, a forbidden act, a curse, and a story of new life and redemption. Now, a quirky tidbit for you. The name Enki means Lord of the Earth, and he is often associated with the waters of life. He is a god of wisdom and creation, and he is a powerful, if sometimes mischievous, figure. The fact that a god of wisdom and life is at the centre of the Dilmun paradise myth is a powerful parallel to the biblical story of Eden, where the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a symbol of wisdom and consciousness, is at the centre of the garden. Historians still argue whether the Dilmun myth is a direct source for the biblical story of Eden. The debate isn't about whether the myths are similar. They clearly are. The debate is about the nature of the borrowing. Was it a direct literary borrowing, or were both myths drawing from a common cultural and oral tradition? The scholarly consensus is that it was probably the latter. The author of Genesis was not copying the Sumerian myths. They were part of a cultural conversation that was happening all across the ancient Near East. They were taking a story that everyone knew, the story of a lost paradise, and they were reinterpreting it, infusing it with their own unique theology. They were taking a polytheistic story of quarrelling gods and turning it into a monotheistic story of a single, all-powerful God and a fall from grace. The Dilmun myth also gives us a powerful clue about the possible physical location of Eden. While Dilmun is most often associated with the modern island of Bahrain, which is in the Persian Gulf, the memory of a lost paradise could have been a memory of the entire flooded basin, which we talked about in a previous section. The idea of a paradise that was lost to a great flood is a theme that runs through both the Dilmun myths and the biblical narrative. The fact that the myths and the geography seem to be pointing in the same direction is a powerful bit of evidence for the Mesopotamian theory. It's a bit like finding 2 different maps of the same treasure, and finding that they both point to the same spot. The Dilmun myth also gives us a different way of looking at the serpent. In the Sumerian myth, the serpent is not a figure of evil. It's a symbol of healing and life, a creature that is associated with the goddess Ninhursag. The serpent in the Garden of Eden, in this context, is not a simple figure of evil, but a more complex, nuanced figure. It's a creature that is associated with wisdom and knowledge, a creature that is not just a symbol of death, but also a symbol of life. The biblical author, in this view, was taking a familiar symbol of wisdom and life, and giving it a new and much more sinister meaning. It's a powerful and creative act of reinterpretation. So, as you lay there, you can feel the quiet warmth of the Persian Gulf, and you can imagine a land of purity and peace, a land where sickness and death were unknown, a land that was a paradise, a land that was a Dilmun. The story of Eden, in this context, is not just a story about a man, a woman and a snake. It's a story about a cultural memory, a memory of a time when the world was a better place, a time when we were a part of a divine plan. And in that memory there is a kind of peace. You're no longer in a small boat on the Persian Gulf. You're in a quiet room, a place of screens and data, a place where science reigns supreme. We've talked a lot about mythology, history and theology in our search for Eden, but what does modern science have to say about all this? Can DNA, the very code of our being, offer us any clues? Can the study of human migration patterns give us a hint about where our journey began? The answer is a surprising and fascinating yes, but it comes with a lot of caveats. This is a mainstream historical fact you should know. The field of genetic anthropology uses DNA to trace the origins and migrations of ancient human populations. By studying the tiny variations in our genetic code, scientists can build a family tree of humanity, tracing our lineage all the way back to our common ancestors. The prevailing scientific theory, known as the Out of Africa theory, posits that all modern humans originated from a single population in Africa around 200,000 years ago. From there they began to migrate, first across the Arabian Peninsula and then across the rest of the world, populating the continents one by one. Now, what does this have to do with Eden? Well, a number of scholars and scientists have tried to use this data to find a scientific Eden, a geographical location where humanity's genetic lineage can be traced back to a single point. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit. In the late 1980s, a team of geneticists at the University of California, Berkeley, published a paper that traced the maternal lineage of all modern humans back to a single woman, a genetic Eve who lived in Africa around 200,000 years ago. This woman, who was dubbed Mitochondrial Eve, was not the only woman alive at the time, but she was the only one whose maternal line has continued unbroken to the present day. Her story is a powerful and very human one. Her descendants, and only her descendants, are who we are today. The idea of a single universal mother, an Eve, is a powerful parallel to the biblical narrative, and it gave a lot of people a lot to think about. The search didn't stop there. Scientists also found a similar common ancestor for all men, a genetic Adam who lived in Africa around 60,000 years ago. This Y-chromosomal Adam, as he was called, was the man from whom all men alive today are descended. His story, and the story of Mitochondrial Eve, gave a lot of people a lot of hope that science was finally going to give us a definitive answer to the Eden question. They were going to give us a map to the beginning of humanity, a map that would lead us right back to our very own Garden of Eden. But this is where the story gets a little bit more complicated. Historians still argue whether the scientific Eve and Adam have any real connection to the biblical story. The debate isn't about whether mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam existed. They almost certainly did. The debate is about what they mean. They are not the first woman or man to ever exist. They were simply the ones whose lineage survived. They are not a single beautiful pair of people in a garden. They are the result of a long, slow and very messy process of evolution and migration. The scientific Adam and Eve are not a couple, and they didn't even live at the same time. The scientific Eve lived around 200,000 years ago, and the scientific Adam lived around 60,000 years ago. The time gap is huge. They are not a creation story, they are an evolutionary one. The scientific consensus is that the Out of Africa theory and the location of humanity's origins is most likely in what is now Eastern Africa. This is a far cry from the Tigris and Euphrates, or the Armenian highlands, or the Persian Gulf. This is a different continent altogether. So science, it seems, has given us an answer, but it's not the one we were looking for. It's a powerful and compelling answer, but it doesn't give us a map to the Garden of Eden. It gives us a map to the human race, and the human race began in Africa. This is a beautiful and very human story, a story of our shared heritage, a story of our deep, unbreakable connection to one another. We're all, in a very real sense, a family. We're all descended from the same ancestors, a group of people who, for whatever reason, left their home in Africa and began a long, slow journey that would eventually take them to every corner of the globe. And in that journey, they carried with them the memory of their home, the memory of their beginning, the memory of their Eden. The Garden of Eden, in this view, is not a place in Mesopotamia, but a place in Africa, a place that we all left a long, long time ago. So as you close your eyes, you can let your mind drift to the plains of Eastern Africa, to the land of our oldest ancestors. You can feel the quiet peace of this place, the sense of a beginning. This is our scientific Eden, a place that is not a myth, but a reality. It's a place that is not a story, but a truth. It's a place that we all came from, and a place that, in a very real sense, we are still on a journey away from. The search for Eden is not a search for a place, but a search for a beginning. And in the data of our DNA, we have found it. The quiet hum of the computer fades, and you're no longer thinking in terms of DNA strands and migration patterns. You're thinking in terms of ink and parchment, of maps and globes, of a time when the world was a much smaller and much more mysterious place. We've talked about the search for Eden, but we haven't talked about the people who were doing the searching. For centuries, the Garden of Eden wasn't just a theological idea, it was a geographical one, a place that cartographers and scholars tried to put on a map. This obsession, this long history of mapping the unmappable, is a fascinating part of our story. Imagine yourself in a dusty library, the smell of old paper and leather in the air. You're looking at a medieval map, a mappa mundi. These were not like our modern maps, which are based on scientific surveys and satellite imagery. These were theological and historical documents, a way of representing the world as a sacred place. The maps were often circular, with Jerusalem at the centre, and at the very top in the east, you would almost always find a depiction of the Garden of Eden. This is a mainstream historical fact. For 1,000 years, the Garden of Eden was a fixed point on the world's mental map, a place that was just as real as Rome or Constantinople. It was a place that was often depicted as a perfect walled garden, with the 4 rivers flowing out from it, a place that was surrounded by a great impassable wall of fire or water. Now, a quirky tidbit for you. The Ebstorf map, a massive world map from the 13th century, is one of the most famous examples of this. It's a huge, circular map, and at the very top, at the edge of the world, is a drawing of the Garden of Eden. It's a beautiful stylized drawing, with Adam and Eve, the serpent, and the 2 trees. The 4 rivers flow out from the garden, and they are labelled as the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Ganges. The mapmakers of the time weren't worried about the fact that the Nile and the Ganges are in completely different parts of the world. They were worried about theology. They were worried about making a map that told a story that began in a garden and ended in a place of divine judgment. The obsession with mapping Eden didn't stop in the medieval period. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as the age of exploration dawned and the world began to be scientifically mapped, scholars began to get a little bit more creative. They were trying to reconcile the biblical geography with the new, scientifically based geography of the world. This is where you get some truly bizarre theories. Some scholars placed Eden at the North Pole, arguing that the biblical description of the river splitting into 4 was a reference to the 4 great rivers of the world, all flowing from the Arctic. Others placed it in China, arguing that the Pishon and Gihon were the Yellow River and the Yangtze. It was a kind of a cartographic free-for-all, with scholars trying to shoehorn a theological text into a scientific reality. This is a good place to bring up a key scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the cartographers of the time genuinely believed they were mapping a real place, or if they were engaging in a kind of pious fiction. The debate isn't about the accuracy of the maps. They were wildly inaccurate. The debate is about the intent. Was it an honest search for a lost place, or was it a theological exercise, a way of making the biblical narrative feel more real and more grounded in a world that was becoming increasingly secular? The answer, as is often the case, is probably a little of both. They were living in a world where the Bible was seen as a historical document, and so they tried to find a place for its geography on their maps. But they were also living in a world of art and symbolism, and so they were not afraid to take liberties with the geography in order to make a theological point. The modern search for Eden is a kind of echo of this ancient obsession. We're still trying to find a physical location for a story that may not have a physical location. We're still trying to put a pin on a map that was never meant to be a map in the first place. The fact that we have this obsession, this long history of trying to find a place that is almost certainly not there, tells us something profound about ourselves. It tells us that we have a deep, enduring longing for a beginning, a longing for a place where we can go back to, a place where everything was right with the world. So as you close your eyes, you can see a map. It's an old map, a little bit faded, with a beautiful stylized drawing of a garden at the very top. The 4 rivers are flowing out from it, and they are going to every corner of the world. It's a beautiful and very human map. It's a map that is not about geography, but about theology. It's a map that is not about where we are, but about where we came from. It's a map of a lost paradise, a paradise that we are still searching for. The maps have been folded and put away, and the dusty library is growing quiet. You're no longer thinking in terms of geography, but in terms of culture. The Garden of Eden, as a story, is not just a geological or theological puzzle, it's a foundational text of Western civilization, a story that has seeped into every corner of our art, literature and film. This is where we stop looking for Eden and start seeing it everywhere. Imagine you're walking through a museum, a place of art and beauty. You're looking at a painting, a Renaissance masterpiece. The subject is instantly recognizable. A man and a woman standing naked in a lush green garden. A serpent is coiled around a tree and a woman is holding a piece of fruit. This is a mainstream historical fact. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden has been one of the most frequently depicted subjects in Western art for centuries. From the breathtaking frescoes of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel to the lush, detailed paintings of Peter Bruegel the Elder, the story of Eden has been a constant source of inspiration. Artists were not just illustrating a story, they were wrestling with its profound themes of innocence, temptation, and the human condition. They were using the story to explore their own ideas about sin, beauty, and the nature of God. The image of the serpent, the apple, even though it's never mentioned in the text, and the shame of nakedness are all powerful visual symbols that have been seared into our collective consciousness by these artists. Now, let's leave the museum and walk into a library. You're surrounded by books, a sea of stories. The story of Eden, in a literary sense, is just as pervasive. It's a foundational text that has been retold, reinterpreted, and reimagined countless times. The great English poet John Milton, in his epic poem Paradise Lost, retold the story from the perspective of Satan, giving us a powerful and very human exploration of the nature of evil and the tragedy of the fall. The story of a perfect world and its loss is a theme that runs through countless works of literature, from Shakespeare's The Tempest to J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. The idea of a lost paradise, a golden age that was corrupted, is a powerful literary device that writers use to explore themes of good and evil, innocence and experience, and the eternal human quest for redemption. This is a quirky tidbit. The phrase, Garden of Eden, has become a part of our everyday language. We use it as a metaphor for any place of perfect beauty, peace, and abundance. If you're on a vacation in a beautiful place, you might say, it's a regular Garden of Eden. We use the phrase to describe something that is perfect, untouched, and pristine. This is not just a literary reference, it's a cultural one. The story has so deeply embedded itself into our language that we use its central idea, its core metaphor, without even thinking about the original story. The story, in a way, has become bigger than the book it came from. Historians still argue whether this cultural legacy has been a good thing or a bad thing for the story itself. The debate isn't about whether the art and literature are beautiful, they clearly are. The debate is about whether these cultural retellings have obscured the original meaning of the story. Has the image of the apple, which isn't in the Bible, become more central to our understanding of the story than the actual moral and theological questions the story is trying to answer? Has the visual beauty of the art made us forget the theological depth of the text? It's a question without a simple answer. The cultural legacy of Eden is both a blessing and a curse. It has kept the story alive, but it has also in some ways changed the story. The story of Eden is also a powerful metaphor in film and popular culture. Think of the movie Avatar, where the main character, Jake Sully, enters a lush, beautiful and pristine world, a world that is in perfect harmony. But this world is threatened by an outside force, a force that wants to take its resources and destroy it. The story of a perfect world and its corruption by an outside force is a powerful one, and it's a story that we see again and again in our popular culture. The Garden of Eden, in this context, is not a religious story. It's a human story. It's a story about our relationship with nature, with technology, and with ourselves. So as you let your mind wander through the great works of Western art and literature, you can see the story of Eden everywhere. It's in the quiet beauty of a painting, the soaring language of a poem, and the powerful imagery of a film. The story is not just a part of our past, it's a part of our present. It's a story that we are still telling, a story that we are still living. The Garden of Eden is not a lost place, it's a lost idea. And in our art and our literature, we're constantly trying to find our way back to it, to find our way back to that state of innocence and grace that we all, on some level, lost a long, long time ago. We've traced the legacy of Eden through art and literature, seeing how its story has become a universal symbol. But the journey isn't over. We've stayed mostly within the confines of the ancient Near East, but the search for a lost paradise has, at times, gone much, much farther afield. Now you can let your mind take flight, soaring across oceans and continents to some of the most far-flung and eccentric theories about the location of the Garden of Eden. These are the fringe theories, the wild cards, the ideas that challenge everything we've talked about so far. Imagine yourself in a quiet study, looking at a book with a beautiful old-fashioned title, Eden in China. You'd probably laugh, right? But for some scholars, this isn't a joke, it's a serious theory. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a number of scholars, most notably a German-American academic named E.L.G. H.W. von Humboldt, argued that the Garden of Eden was located in China. The theory was based on a number of tenuous connections, including a very liberal interpretation of the biblical river names. The Pishon, they argued, was the Yellow River, and the Gihon was the Yangtze. The Tigris and Euphrates, of course, were the Xinjiang and the Pearl River, which flow through southern China. The land of Havilah, with its gold and precious stones, was a reference to the mineral-rich mountains of central China. The theory, of course, doesn't hold up to any kind of modern scrutiny. The geography is completely wrong, and there is no linguistic or historical evidence to support the idea. But it tells us something profound about the human desire to connect the sacred to the familiar. For a European scholar living in the 19th century, China was a land of ancient, mysterious wisdom, and it was a powerful and compelling place to set the beginning of the world. It was a way of making the biblical narrative feel more universal, a way of saying that the story of Eden was not just a story for the Near East, but a story for the whole world. Now, let's take an even bigger leap. Imagine yourself in a different kind of study, one filled with books on Mormon theology and American folklore. This is where we find one of the most surprising and most American theories about the location of Eden, the idea that it was located in Missouri. This is a mainstream historical fact, though it's a belief held by a specific religious group, the Latter-day Saints. The founder of the faith, Joseph Smith, declared that the Garden of Eden was located in a place called Adamondiaman in Davis County, Missouri. He claimed that this was the place where Adam and Eve settled after they were banished from the garden, and that it was also the place where they built an altar and where they will one day return. The theological foundation for this belief is rooted in the Book of Mormon and other Latter-day Saint scriptures, which are considered to be divinely inspired. The belief is that Adam and Eve were a real, historical couple, and that the Garden of Eden was a real, historical place. The location in Missouri is a place of deep theological significance for the Latter-day Saints, and it's a place that is still revered and visited by members of the faith. The fact that a powerful modern religion has its own unique, geographically specific theory about the location of Eden is a testament to the enduring power of the story. The Garden of Eden, for them, is not a metaphor or a myth. It's a foundational truth, a place that is as real as any other place on Earth. This is a good place to bring up a key scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Joseph Smith's revelations about the location of Eden were a genuine theological insight or a clever way of grounding his new religion in a specific American geography. The debate isn't about the sincerity of the belief, it's about the origins of the belief. Was it a divine revelation, or was it a theological innovation? The answer, of course, depends on your own religious and theological perspective. But for our purposes, it tells us something fascinating about the nature of the search for Eden. The search for a lost paradise is not just an ancient obsession, it's a modern one. It's a search that has been going on for millennia, and it's a search that is still going on today. The fact that the search for Eden has taken us to China and Missouri, and to countless other places in between, tells us that the story is not just a story about a place. It's a story about a universal human longing for a beginning, a longing for a lost home. The location of Eden, in a way, is a mirror that reflects our own cultural and theological preoccupations. For a medieval cartographer, Eden was in the East. For a 19th century scholar, it was in China. For a 21st century Latter-day Saint, it's in Missouri. The location changes, but the longing remains the same. The story of Eden in this context is not a story that is limited by geography or by time. It's a story that is as big as the world, a story that is as old as humanity. It's a story that we have all, in our own way, been telling and retelling for millennia. And in our search for a physical location for Eden, we are not just looking for a place. We are looking for ourselves. We are looking for our own beginning, our own lost innocence, our own lost paradise. And in that search, we find a kind of peace. You're no longer in a library, a museum, or a quiet study. You're simply here, in the quiet darkness, and the journey is almost over. We've gone from the rivers of Mesopotamia to the DNA of our ancestors, from the cartographic obsessions of the Middle Ages to the cultural legacy of our modern world. We've searched for a physical place, and we've searched for a metaphorical one. And now, at the very end, we must ask the most profound question of all. Why does the idea of the Garden of Eden continue to hold such a powerful grip on the human imagination? The answer, it seems, is not in the location of the garden, but in the idea of the garden itself. The Garden of Eden is more than a story. It's a profound psychological archetype. It's a symbol of a lost state of being, a state of perfect harmony and innocence that we all, on some level, lost a long, long time ago. It's a story of our innermost longing, a longing for a world that is not broken, a world that is not filled with suffering and death. This is a mainstream historical fact. The idea of a lost paradise is a universal human concept. It's a theme that runs through almost every culture, every religion, every mythology. It's a reflection of our deep, enduring sense that the world is not as it should be, that we have as a species fallen from a state of grace. The story of Eden, in this context, is not a unique story. It's a powerful and beautiful expression of a universal human truth. It's a story that we all tell ourselves, in one form or another, to explain our own brokenness, our own suffering, and our own mortality. The Garden of Eden, in a psychological sense, is a metaphor for our own childhood. It's a time of innocence, a time when we were not yet aware of the moral complexities of the world. It was a time when the world was a safe, perfect place, and when our needs were met by a loving, protective presence. The fall from grace in this view is a metaphor for our own coming of age, our own loss of innocence. It's the moment we realise that the world is not a perfect place, and that we are not a perfect people. It's the moment we eat from the tree of knowledge, and we become aware of our own mortality, our own shame, our own flaws. It's a painful but necessary transition. We must leave the garden in order to become who we are meant to be. Now, a quirky tidbit for you. The word paradise itself has a fascinating etymology. It comes from the old Persian word peridesa, which means a walled or enclosed garden. The Persians, who were the masters of landscape architecture in the ancient world, created these beautiful walled gardens, which were a symbol of peace, order, and abundance. The word was adopted by the Greeks and then by the Romans, and it eventually found its way into the biblical narrative. So when the author of Genesis was writing about a garden in Eden, they were tapping into a cultural and linguistic tradition that was already thousands of years old. The idea of a walled, perfect garden was a powerful and resonant one, and it was a perfect metaphor for the theological idea of a perfect enclosed world. Historians still argue whether the story of Eden is a true historical account or a psychological truth. The debate isn't about the existence of a literal garden, it's about the nature of truth itself. Is a story true because it is historically accurate? Or is it true because it speaks to a deeper, more profound, and more universal human truth? The scholarly consensus is that the story of Eden is both. It's a story that is rooted in a specific time and place, a story that is filled with historical and mythological allusions. But it's also a story that transcends its own historical context, a story that speaks to a universal human experience. It's a story that is true, not because it happened in a specific location, but because it happens in all of us. The Garden of Eden is our story. It's the story of our lost innocence, our coming of age, our suffering, and our hope for redemption. It's the story of our deep, enduring longing for a world that is not broken. And in that longing we find a kind of peace. We find a kind of comfort. We are not just a random collection of atoms in a meaningless universe. We are the children of a lost paradise, and we are on a long, slow journey back. And in that journey we can find a kind of meaning, a kind of purpose. So as the darkness deepens and the quiet settles in, you can let go of the search for a physical location for Eden. The rivers, the trees, the mountains, and the lost continents, they are all just part of the story. The real location of the garden is in a quieter place. It's in the depths of our own minds, in the quiet longing of our own hearts. It's a memory of a time before the world was broken, a memory of a state of being that we all, on some level, lost a long, long time ago. The search for Eden is not about finding a place, it's about finding ourselves. The final pages of the journey are turning now. The whisper of the narrator's voice is softening, and the images are beginning to fade. You're no longer a traveller in a world of ancient rivers and sunken lands, but a quiet, peaceful presence, floating on the surface of your own thoughts. The mystery of Eden, with its impossible geography and its profound symbolism, is not solved, but it has been heard. The quest for a lost beginning, for a pristine home, is a search that ends not with a final destination, but with a quiet understanding that the beginning is a part of us, an echo in our own hearts and minds. The search for a lost garden is, in the end, a search for a lost innocence, and that is a search that never truly ends. So let the questions fade, let the maps dissolve into dust, and let the rivers flow on without a name. The only thing that remains is the quiet understanding that the garden is not a place you can visit, but a state of being you can remember. Let that memory be a quiet comfort, a gentle guide as you drift deeper into the quiet of the night. Sleep now and dream of gardens and of peace.